The Cold War was a period in history between the end of World War II and the early 90s, during which the United States and the Soviet Union competed to be the dominant superpower in the world. It was a period of conflict and tension, although never actual battle, as the two countries and their allies tried to outdo each other in multiple categories, including military, technology, ideology, and economy. The Olympics were one of the major ways the United States and the Soviet Union fought without armed conflict. Why do you think the Olympics were so important?
They were a world stage for dominance and to show the world how powerful each country was without going to war. It was kind of like the old Greek wars where they'd meet in the arena and decide who was the most superior, and this gave the Russians a good chance to show that they were just as advanced or just as physically fit as the Western nations.
By 1980, the Olympics had become one of the most visible ways the ordinary Americans could see how the Cold War was going, since almost everything else was confidential. Many Americans would closely follow the results, which seemed to be a national importance.
I was in middle school in the early 80s, and I remember that the Olympics seemed to be really significant with regards to how the United States was doing in its Cold War against the Soviet Union. My family, my friends, basically the whole community, really watched the outcome of the Olympics. And it was certainly a situation of national pride when the Americans won, and it was almost fear when the Soviets won and when they were pulling ahead, because it felt like we might be losing not only that Olympic competition, but the Cold War as well.
Winning Olympic medals for both the Soviet Union and the United States have become not simply a symbol of athletic excellence and national pride, but an important propaganda tool in the Cold War battle between the two rivals. The Soviet Union and its communist allies treated Olympic medalists as national heroes. A world Soviet gymnast described the process. There would be special trainers who would come to look for talented children for a type of sport. These children then knew only a life of education and sport.
The Miracle on Ice hockey game was one of the most memorable parts of the 1980 Winter Olympics.
In 1980, after winning since 1956, hockey was viewed as a Soviet game. The United States was experiencing economic hard time, gas lines, and the hostages in Iran. The U.S. hockey team was made up of inexperienced college athletes who was put together just to play the Soviets in the game. The Soviet team had been together for years, almost a professional team. In a dramatic and exciting game, the U.S. beat the Soviets in a Miracle on Ice. The U.S. team went to the final round and beat the Finland for the gold medal. It was just what the people needed to uplift their spirits.
What do you remember about the Miracle on Ice?
That hockey game was probably the biggest thing of that Olympics, obviously, for the United States. Usually it's the track and field thing, but since the Soviets had been so dominant in hockey, and the United States team was such an underdog, that it got everybody's attention. And I think everybody with a TV set in the United States was certainly tuned in that night, as was the case probably in the Soviet Union. So it was a real display of who's the most powerful on a sport that is somewhat violent. So it was a real epic event for both countries, I'm sure.
In fact, the most important battle of the entire 1980 Olympics was the hockey game between the Soviet Union and the United States. It did not matter if the United States won a medal. All that mattered was that the United States hockey team beat the Soviets. That game was so important to the United States and to its citizens that every single person I knew in my school, in my family, in my community during that game was glued to the TV set. I remember clearly my entire family and my entire neighborhood gathering together watching that game on the TV set. Nobody was doing anything else. In fact, during the game when the Soviet Union fell behind the U.S. during the last few minutes, I remember my grandfather jumping up and down in the middle of the living room, screaming at the television set at the top of his lungs, check those commies, come on, don't let them win, don't let them win. And then when finally the clock ticked over and the United States won, the whole community just erupted. People were yelling and cheering in the streets. It was as if we had finally won the Cold War.
But the Americans would not have the opportunity to battle the Soviets in the 1980 Summer Olympic Games, which were to be held in Moscow. At the end of 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. President Jimmy Carter tried to have the Games moved from Moscow, warning that the U.S. would boycott if Soviet troops were not withdrawn. The 1980 boycott.
Along with the United States, 60 other nations boycotted the Olympics. Attendance was down to 81 nations compared to the 1972 attendance of 122 nations.
In the end, Carter's decision did not change the Soviet Union's position in Afghanistan, but the dreams of all U.S. athletes who could have attended were crushed.
There are two types of athletes from 1980, those who moved on with their life and those whose life was never the same. I have friends who still don't talk about it, who are bitter and whose whole life derailed from that point.
We are simply a tool, an implement. No one cares at all until we can be used for their purposes. Then they use us.
Darn right I'm being selfish. It's just like anything else. The U.S. is made up of a lot of number ones. They look out for number one first.
I was right then and I'm right now. It's the athletes who do all the work, so it should be the athlete's job to decide. That right was taken away by the federal government, of all people.
At the time, I was really angry, but looking back, it beat sending 18-year-olds over there with guns.
The 1984 Summer Olympics, Los Angeles, California.
And the 1984 Summer Games were held in Los Angeles, and the Soviet Union, along with 13 of its allies, boycotted those games.
Even though the Soviets and their allies were missing, the Los Angeles Games had 140 nations attend, more than at any previous Olympics. The 1984 Olympics were also the first since 1932 to make money instead of lose it.
The Cold War started to end in the early 1990s as the Soviet Union began shifting from communism to a market economy and started major reductions in its military.
In conclusion, the Olympics played a huge propaganda role during the Cold War. It allowed the two superpowers, who could have destroyed each other with nuclear weapons, compete in athletic battles for medals rather than fight with armed forces.